This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Erica Pearson. This episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by Primrose Schools. Today's show is about a potato chip company that has become a regional icon in the Midwest. And it's something I remember from my own childhood at family picnics or cabin trips. Someone would always bring a twin pack of Old Dutch chips, the ones that come in a box. It turns out the company began in St. Paul. Reader Jeff Tollefson has a cabin in northern Wisconsin, not far from where I grew up, actually. And his cabin neighbors told him that they researched the history of their house in St. Paul and learned it was the birthplace of Old Dutch. Jeff reached out to the Minnesota Star Tribune because he wanted to learn more about the potato chip company's beginnings.
He had an inkling that Old Dutch started in the house in St. Paul and had a lot of the details down, how the Old Dutch name originated and just how the gentleman that started it, the father or whatever, how he just continued to work. And it was such a cool story. I thought, Curious Minnesota would just like it. And so I went to the Strib and, submitted the question, and that's how it all started.
I'm here today with my colleague Brooks Johnson, who wrote a story on the history of Old Dutch potato chips for Curious Minnesota. Welcome, Brooks. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Erica.
So this story seemed to be a perfect fit for you and your beat here at the Minnesota Star Tribune. Can you share a little bit about what you cover here?
Yeah, I write about the food industry. And when I tell people that, they're like, oh, you mean like restaurants? No, we have lots of other great reporters who do that. I write about the business of food. So General Mills, Hormel, Post, this little mom and pop shop called Cargill. I don't know if you've heard of them. CHS, Land O'Lakes, all the food companies, the folks who are sort of making the food we eat and sell it at grocery stores. So yeah, Old Dutch, that's been on my radar for a long time. I'm really glad this came across our desk.
Yeah. So what drew you to this question? Tell us about your connection to these chips.
Well, growing up in Fargo, North Dakota, there was always a box of Old Dutch chips in my parents' cupboard in the Lazy Susan, right in my mind where I could go to reach for them. And so it was just part of a Midwestern childhood growing up. And I think that's why the story resonated with so many people, is that it's been part of many of our childhoods growing up, and it's just sort of part of lake culture. It's part of Minnesota's food scene, as it were. These are the chips you bring home. That's the old standby.
Yeah, the ones you bring up to the cabin with the top the tater.
Oh, yeah.
So you touched on this a little bit, but you started your story by talking about the ways that Old Dutch stands out in the chip aisle as a regional favorite. So what's different about them?
Yeah, putting it in a box. And actually, I didn't get to write about this in the story much, but they actually started in a tin. They would sell them in these really big metal tins, bigger than you might imagine. Maybe think about the Boy Scout popcorn tins. That's about how big they were. And eventually, they decided to put them in boxes. They would put them in bags, and then the bags would go in boxes. Now, all the competitors and the national brands, of course, we know them, Dorito bags, Frito bags, in these plastic crinkly bags. Standing out on an aisle, stocked with all these national competitors that from multi-million-dollar ad campaigns. That's been one way that Old Dutch has been able to stay in the public imagination, is like, oh yeah, that's that brand. They do that thing. It's in a box, and that's usually their twin pack or their triple pack, so you get more bang for your buck.
Very cool. So where did this company begin 90 years ago?
Let's roll the tape back to 1934. It was a man named Karl Marx. That's Karl with a C, no known relation to the German philosopher. It was in his kitchen in the McAllister Groveland neighborhood of St. Paul in 1934 that Karl Marx started just hand cooking batches of potato chips. He'd fry them in oil, package them in little wax bags, and sell them to local markets. That took off pretty quickly, and he set up shop in Minneapolis, where the company would remain for decades. That was in 1937.
So why that name? Why Old Dutch?
Yeah, well, from what I could find in my research, Karl Marx just wanted something to signify, cleanliness and sort of this standard quality. And I guess the Dutch had that reputation back then. It reminded me of, when 3M was naming their Scotch tape. It was actually a derogatory slang back then to say like this, get this Scotch tape out of here. I guess Dutch is the opposite of that.
Interesting. So your story included a really cool photo of Old Dutch's first factory in Minneapolis, and I'm wondering if you can describe it for us and talk a little bit about what the place was like.
Yeah, big old brick building downtown, and notably had these giant windows that you can look through and see potato chips coming down the line, folks sorting them with their hands and just going through and making sure that only the best quality chips were getting in those bags that would end up in those boxes.
So you could actually see it from the street as you're walking by?
Yes, that was the coolest thing about that old building. It's not as common in manufacturing at all today to be able to provide a window into the actual operations, especially in food, where everything's got to be very, buttoned up and safe and make sure no germs get in. But people, the photo in the story, if you go see it, it's a few women standing outside just watching it happen. And I would have loved to have seen that.
So the company got its windmill logo that we recognize today back in the 1940s?
Yeah, it was just around World War II where they enlisted Minneapolis artist Les Kuba, a fairly well-known fellow, who designed that famed windmill logo and gave it the colors that we all know today, the red, yellow, the white. I mean, that's what helps the company stand out. That's remained unchanged now for, 80 years?
And then in 1951, Mark sells. So who are the new owners?
Yes, it was Vernon Onenson and Arthur Eggert. Mark sold the company for just $250,000. And within just a few years, the new owners tripled production and sales had grown from $1 million to $20 million annually. So they had their sights set on growth.
Yeah, and they didn't just grow in the U.S. I understand that Old Dutch is big in Canada. How did that happen?
It is like the chip brand in Canada. A lot of Canadians actually think it was a Canadian brand, like it was started in Canada because it is just so pervasive up there. It's nationwide, unlike in the U.S. where it's a Midwestern brand. It is coast to coast in Canada from Vancouver to Halifax.
And they have some different flavors up there, I understand.
Yeah, so I don't think they did right away. When they expanded to Canada in the 1950s, I don't know if they had the ketchup-flavored chips right away, but that's been a big hit. And the all-dressed varieties, which if you've never tried, it's like all these condiments you'd find in your fridge at any time, just mashed up together. And it's so, so delicious. I mean, there's very vinegar-forward flavors up there, kind of like you'd get with it kind of any Canadian treats that aren't so appealing to an American audience. It's that vinegar tang that they love so much. And so if Old Dutch is listening, please bring those down here.
So you've actually tried these chips, huh?
Oh, they're so good. Yeah, not just on trips to Canada, but they did have a limited ketchup offering, and you can find them some places here in the U.S. from Old Dutch. So
that's so interesting. I think I'm going to pass on the ketchup. A disaster in 1965, you wrote, led to big changes at the company.
Yeah. So crazy enough, when the Old Dutch warehouse burned down in downtown Minneapolis, production wasn't interrupted at all. All their machinery was spared. So they were able to keep up their momentum and grow their multi-million-dollar business. But they said, maybe we should look for somewhere bigger because we still want to grow and grow and grow. And so they went out to Roseville. In 1968, Old Dutch opened their new plant, their new headquarters in Roseville, and that's been their home to this day. They've definitely grown it since then, and it's very crowded now. But they are frying millions of pounds of potatoes in millions of pounds of oil every year.
So in the 70s, they roll out the twin pack box. And then in the decades that follow, these chips really became a part of our popular culture. You mentioned some movies that they show up in.
Yeah. Oh, I think everyone caught it on Fargo. I mean, you see her just eating the chips in bed, right? I mean, that scene. It's also in Grumpier Old Men. And so just knowing that, like, it's so Minnesota at this point that it's a prop in movies set in Minnesota. Like, that's how you know you've made it, I think, as a cultural icon.
So Minnesota. We'll be right back.
At Primrose, our balanced learning approach means exploring academic skills and life skills, combining purposeful play with nurturing guidance from teachers, and setting children up for success in future classrooms. Learn more at primroseschools.com/Twin Cities.
And we're back. So for this story, and I was a little jealous of this, you actually got to go on a tour of Old Dutch's plant in Roseville. What was it like? Does it just smell like potato chips when you walk in?
It's like the freshest potato chips you'll ever smell, and everything is so very just clean and bright smelling, and you get some of the seasoning when you walk around. There's sort of seasoning barrels that they use now. So Stephanie Onenson, the granddaughter of Vern Onenson, who bought and eventually owned the controlling stake in Old Dutch, showed me around. She's now sort of the director of special projects and is the heir apparent, although she says her dad isn't just going to hand her over the company. She's got to earn it. So Stephanie shows us around and points to all the machinery, old and new, that's used to take in, literal truckloads of potatoes that are just dumped onto these conveyor belts. They're cleaned, they're sliced, the bad ones are sent to pig farmers to feed their pigs, so there's no waste. Everything gets eaten by someone or something. It goes from just conveyor belt to conveyor belt, and there's all these optical sensors making sure that, again, that only good potatoes, like you open a bag and, you see a couple off colors, but you're never going to get a bag full of just like brown and like really spotty potato chips. I mean, technology is a big part of that. It used to be, human beings would just like look at them and grab them off the line. And now you've got a lot of technology making sure that happens. And that happens several times. So, they're sprayed down, they're cleaned, they're sliced, they're cleaned again, they're sorted, and, they try to get that same size, relative size. None too small, none too big. Although if there's a box of all big potato chips, I think those are great. So please sell me those. You walk through the line, and again, there's multiple rooms. There's, conveyor belts, floor to ceiling. There's pipes everywhere, with water to make sure things stay clean. It's just buzzing. They're blowing up, potato chip bags and forming them as they're coming down a chute to be filled. So, everything is happening kind of at once, but through different stages. And the crazy thing is, they've got their kettle chips, right? And that's just a massive operation on its own. And you've got just huge tanks, huge stainless steel oil tanks. And I'll say, too, they get train loads. Like train cars full of vegetable oil to fry this stuff, like multiple cars a week. So it's a major operation, and I was very fortunate to get in there. I posted this on LinkedIn after I wrote the story, but that was a career highlight for me, and I've flown with the Blue Angels for my job, so that was really cool.
Sounds amazing. So what do you think is next for this company that began way back when in a St. Paul kitchen?
There's definitely expansion on the horizon, but they're going to go slow and steady. This company has, made itself a Midwestern icon by, taking the right chances and the right risks. And one of the big ways they've done that is by moving into Canada and becoming just a huge presence there. They have more plants in Canada, in fact, than they do in the United States. They just have 2 here that does their corn chips, and the main one I toured that does their potato manufacturing. So more room to expand, which could mean more geographic expansion. Right now, they're in 10 states, from Montana to Michigan down to Kansas and Missouri. And, they'd like to go a little more national. And they've bought other brands like Humpty Dumpty in the Northeast to accomplish that. But Stephanie says, I think in my career, it's going to be, what does our future look like? Does it look like more? So they just hit 90 years old. I wonder if they're going to be in more stores when they hit 100. One thing I was told and promised is that it's still going to be family owned. Of course they get courted by big companies who want to scoop up this legendary brand, but I think the Onenson family is going to own it as long as I'm writing about them.
Well, that is it for today's show. Thank you so much, Brooks.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
You can read all of our Curious Minnesota stories online at startribune.com/curious. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. Do you have feedback for us or a question you'd like us to answer? Send a note to curious@startribune.com.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.